There are nights when the air feels older than it should, when the silence between thoughts stretches long enough that you begin to notice what fills it. Not sound exactly, not memory in the way we usually think of it, but something quieter, something that has been waiting, perhaps for a very long time. Tonight, we turn our attention to a question that has no certain answer, a question that lives in the space between what was written down and what was simply carried forward. What if the earliest kings of Sumer were not the first of their kind, but the last? What if they did not begin a tradition, but inherited one? Fragments of something far older, passed down through generations who had watched their entire world disappear. The cities of Sumer rose along the rivers of southern Mesopotamia more than 5,000 years ago. Uruk, Ur, Eridu, names that still echo faintly through time. These were places of clay and reeds, of temple platforms rising toward the sky, of scribes learning to press wedges into wet tablets, creating the earliest writing we know. But before the cities, there may have been something else entirely. The Sumerian king list is one of the strangest documents to survive from the ancient world. It records the names of rulers, the lengths of their reigns, the cities they governed. But it does something unusual. It begins not with the first king of Sumer as we know it, but with kings who ruled before a great flood, a deluge that swept the world clean and divided all of history into two epochs. Before and after, the reigns of these early kings are recorded in numbers that make no sense by any human measure. Tens of thousands of years. Lifetimes that stretch across ages. And then, after the flood, the numbers shift. They become smaller, more recognizable. As if something fundamental had changed, scholars have long dismissed as a symbolic language of a people who did not yet think in historical terms. Perhaps these numbers mean nothing at all. But what if they meant something different? What if they were not meant to be read as literal years, but as something else? Markers of time perceived differently, remembered differently, by people who had inherited stories from an age when the world itself was not what it later became. Imagine for a moment that you are standing at the edge of memory. Not your own memory, not even the memory of your grandparents or their grandparents, but the memory of your people, that long unbroken thread, stretching back through generations, each one holding fragments of what came before, each one king now. You rule a city of mud brick and woven reed. Your people plant barley in the rich soil left by the rivers flooding. They dig canals to carry water where it is needed. They fire clay into pots, weave cloth, raise children, bury their dead. But you know something they do not. You know that this world, this way of living is new. You know because you were told, because your father told you, and his father told him. And the chain goes back farther than anyone can count. You know that once, long ago, there was another world, a world that ended not in fire, not in war. The memory is not clear. It has been passed down too many times, smoothed by repetition like a stone in a river. But certain details remain: the water rising, the land disappearing, the sky dark for days, or weeks, or months. And when it was over, almost everything was gone. But the world they had known, these cities, the fields, the order of things, did not. What survived were fragments, stories, rituals, numbers that once meant something specific, but now floated free of their original context. Names of gods who had walked among people, or so it was remembered. Techniques for measuring time, for tracking the stars, for building in ways that would endure. And the knowledge that all of this could be lost again. So you guard it, not because you seek power, not because you wish to control, but because someone must. Because if you do not hold these fragments carefully, they will slip away entirely. And the world that came before, the one your distant ancestors knew, will be forgotten completely. This is what it may have meant to be a king in early Sumer. Not a conqueror, not a warrior chief seizing power through strength, a custodian, someone chosen, or perhaps burdened, with the task of preservation. The earliest Sumerian cities were not like later empires. They did not expand aggressively. They did not seek to dominate their neighbors. Each city remained largely independent, centered around its temple, its patron deity. The king was called the Nc or the Lugal, terms that meant something like priest king or great man. He was both a political leader and a religious figure. He mediated between the human world and the divine. He performed rituals that kept the cosmic order intact. He ensured that the temple was maintained, that the offerings were made, that the sacred calendar was observed. But why? Why did these early rulers invest so much effort in preserving specific rituals, specific numbers, specific ways of doing things? Perhaps because they believed, or had been taught these practices, that they came from a time when the gods still walked the earth. Before they withdrew into silence, the Sumerians remembered the Anunnaki, not as distant abstract deities, but as beings who had once been present, who had taught, who had guided, who had established the order of civilization, and then, for reasons never fully explained, the memory of the Anunnaki is woven through Sumerian literature. They appear in hymns, in myths, in king lists. They are described as the great gods who decreed the fates, who assigned roles and responsibilities, who gave humanity the knowledge of agriculture, writing, kingship. But they are also described as distant, as having departed, as no longer directly involved in the affairs of mortals. What if this departure was remembered because it had actually happened, not literally perhaps? Not in the way a person leaves a room, but in the way a presence fades when an age ends, when a flood erases the world, and those who survive must begin again, carrying only what they can remember. The Sumerian kings may have seen themselves as continuing something that had been interrupted, as maintaining traditions established long ago by beings, or teachers, or ancestors. Sum were no longer the knowledge. They built temples according to specific proportions. They observed festivals at precise times. They recorded the movements of the stars with careful attention. They preserved lists of kings, of gods, of sacred objects, even when the original meaning had become unclear. They did this not out of superstition, but out of reverence, out of the understanding that they were holding something fragile, something that had nearly been lost once before. There is a particular kind of silence that comes with responsibility, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of watching, of knowing that if you turn away even for a moment, something essential might slip through your fingers and be gone forever. This may have been the silence the Sumerian kings lived within. Consider the city of Eridu in Sumerian memory. Eridu was the first city, not the oldest settlement archaeologists have found. There were villages and farming communities long before Eridu, with the first true city, the first place where kingship descended from heaven, as the texts say. The first place where order took hold. Eridu was sacred to Enki, the god of fresh water, of wisdom, of secret knowledge. His temple there, the Abzu, was rebuilt again and again over thousands of years, each new structure raised directly atop the ruins of the one before. 17 layers of temple, one stacked upon another, as if each generation was determined to maintain the connection to what had come before. Even as the physical structure crumbled. Why such devotion to continuity? Why not build somewhere new, somewhere easier, somewhere the ground had not already been claimed by ancestors long dead? Perhaps because the location itself was remembered as significant, not just symbolically, but as a place where something had happened, where knowledge had been given, where the first teachers, whoever or whatever they were, had established the pattern that all later cities would follow. The Sumerians had a word for this kind of knowledge. The me, were not laws exactly, nor customs, nor skills. They were something deeper, the fundamental principles that allowed civilization to exist. Kingship was a me, writing, agriculture, music, warfare, justice. Saw of these were me. But the me were not invented by humans. According to Sumerian tradition, they were given, bestowed, entrusted to humanity by the gods, particularly by Enki, who held them in his underwater temple and guarded them carefully, releasing them only to those who were ready. What if this memory reflects something real? Not gods in a literal sense, but teachers, predecessors, survivors of an earlier world, who possessed knowledge that the new world desperately needed. Imagine again that you are that king. You have been taught the me since childhood. You know the proper way to perform the New Year ritual. You know the correct proportions for building a temple. You know which offerings must be made and when, and in what order. You know the names of the stars and how to track their movements through the seasons. You know all of this, not because you invented it, but because it was taught to you. And you were taught because your teacher was taught. And so on back through time, until the chain reaches figures so distant they have ceased to be entirely human in memory, and have become something else, gods, or god-kings, or simply the ones who came before. Your responsibility is not to change this knowledge, not to improve it, not even necessarily to understand it fully. Your responsibility is simply to preserve it, to pass it forward intact, to ensure that the thread does not break. Because if it breaks, everything that survived the flood, all that fragile, precious knowledge, will be lost a second time. And this time, there may be no one left to remember even the fragments. The king list records that after the flood, kingship descended once more, first to Kish, then to Uruk, then to other cities in turn. The reigns become shorter, the kings become more recognizably human, but the pattern remains. Each king is seen as holding a sacred office, maintaining a divine order. One of the most famous of these early kings was Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh who ruled Uruk, Gilgamesh who sought immortality, Gilgamesh who traveled to the ends of the earth to find Utnapishtim, the man who survived the flood and was granted eternal life. The Epic of Gilgamesh is often read as a story about mortality, about the futility of seeking to escape death, and it is that. But it is also a story about memory. Gilgamesh seeks out Utnapishtim, not just to learn the secret of immortality, but to hear the story of what happened, to connect with someone who actually lived through the event that divided all of history into before and after. When Gilgamesh finally finds Utnapishtim, the old man tells him the story of the flood, how the gods decided to destroy humanity, how Ea Utnapishtim, and told him to build a boat, how the waters rose and covered the earth, how everything was destroyed except for Utnapishtim, his family, and the animals he saved. And then Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh something else. He tells him that the secret of immortality is not something that can be obtained, that the gods granted it to him as a unique exception. And it will not be granted again, that Gilgamesh must return to his city and accept his mortality. But he gives Gilgamesh something else instead. A plant that restores youth, a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea. Gilgamesh dives down and retrieves it. He brings it back with him, intending to share it with his people, to let the old become young again. But before he can return to Uruk, a serpent steals the plant while Gilgamesh is bathing, and it is lost. The story ends with Gilgamesh returning to his city empty-handed. He has gained no immortality. He has lost the plant of youth. But he returns to Uruk and looks upon its walls he built, and finds a kind of peace in knowing that his work will outlast him. What is this story really about? Perhaps it is about the limits of what can be recovered from the past, about the impossibility of returning to the world that was lost, about accepting that some things are gone forever, and that the only path forward is to build something new while honoring what remains. Gilgamesh sought the old world. He sought the secrets of those who lived before the flood, and he learned that those secrets cannot be fully reclaimed, that the plant of youth, the vitality of that earlier age, beat beyond his reach. But the walls of Uruk remain, the city remains, the knowledge of how to build, how to organize, how to rule, that remains. And perhaps that is enough. The Sumerian kings did not live in the world before the flood, they lived in the world after. A world that had to be rebuilt from fragments. A world where the gods no longer walked openly, where the teachers had withdrawn, where all that remained was memory and the determination to honor it. They built their temples in the old proportions, because those proportions were all they had. They performed the rituals in the old ways, because the old ways were what survived. They recorded the king lists and the god lists and the hymns, because writing itself was a form of preservation, now way to hold memory in place, so that it could not slip away entirely. And they ruled not as tyrants, but as guardians, as men and women who understood that they had inherited something precious, and that their task was not to possess it but to protect it, to keep it alive through their generations so that it could be passed to the next. There is a text from ancient Sumer called The instructions of Shuruppak. Shuruppak was a king, or perhaps a sage who lived before the flood. The text is presented as his advice to his son, Siasudra, who would later survive the deluge and become the Sumerian equivalent of Noah. The instructions are practical. Be humble. Do not speak rashly. Do not travel at night. Do not choose a wife during a festival. Work hard. Respect your elders. But woven through these practical teachings is something else. A sense that the world is fragile, that order must be maintained carefully. That wisdom is not something you discover on your own, but something you receive and pass forward. Do not reject the word of your mother and your father. Shuruppak tells his son, pay attention to their words. Why such emphasis on listening, on receiving, on honoring what has been taught? Perhaps because Shuruppak knew, or the people who remembered him knew, that in a world where everything can be swept away in an instant, the only immortality is in the transmission of knowledge from one generation. The kings of Sumer were Shurupak's heirs. They carried forward what he carried, what his father carried, what the long chain of ancestors carried, stretching back through time to a world that no longer existed except in memory. And they carried it quietly, without fanfare, without grand declarations. They simply did the work of preservation. Day after day, year after year, generation after generation, until writing fixed it in place, until the clay tablets hardened and the memory became permanent, until the knowledge was no longer just whispered but inscribed. There are things that can only be understood in the half-light between waking and sleep. When the mind stops insisting on certainty and allows the possibility that what was forgotten might be just as true as what was remembered. The Sumerian kings lived in that half-light. They ruled cities of the present while holding memories of a past that could no longer be verified. They served gods who no longer appeared. They maintained rituals whose original purposes had grown dim with time, and yet they continued, because continuation itself had become sacred. Consider the ziggurat. These step pyramids rose at the center of every major Sumerian city. Ur had one, Uruk had one, Eridu, Nippur, Lagos. All of them raised these massive structures of mud brick toward the sky, each one requiring thousands of workers, years of labor, enormous resources. But they were not tombs. They were not fortresses. They were not even, strictly speaking, places where ordinary people worshipped. Or more precisely, they were places where the divine and human worlds could meet, where the god could descend from heaven and dwell briefly in the chamber at the summit, where the king could ascend and perform rituals that maintained the cosmic order. The word ziggurat itself comes from a root meaning to build high, or pinnacle. But the Sumerians had another way of describing these structures. They called them the bond between heaven and earth. Why did they build them this way? Why not simple temples at ground level? Why invest such tremendous effort in raising platforms high into the air, creating artificial mountains in a flat river plain where no natural mountains existed? Not copying in the sense of imitation, but copying in the sense of remembering, of trying to recreate, with the materials they had, something their ancestors had described, something that existed in the world before. There is a persistent tradition, not just in Sumer, but across many ancient cultures, that the gods lived on mountains, that sacred knowledge came from high places, that those who wished to commune with the divine had to ascend. But southern Mesopotamia has no mountains. It is flat, alluvial, plain, built up over millennia by sediment deposited. The only heights are the ones humans create, so they created them. They built artificial mountains, using millions of sun-dried bricks, raising platforms, creating a geography of reverence in a landscape that did not naturally provide it. What if this impulse came from ancestral memory? What if the survivors of the flood, those who settled in southern Mesopotamia and began building the first cities, remembered that sacred knowledge had once been associated with high places? That in the world before, there had been mountains where teachers dwelt, where wisdom was preserved, where one could go to receive instruction? And what if, finding themselves in a land without such mountains, they decided to build them not as mere symbols, but as functional spaces, as actual places where the connection between worlds could be maintained? The temple at the summit of the ziggurat was called the Gipar, or sometimes the Esiara. new house of the universe. It was typically small, just a single chamber, but it was the most sacred space in the entire city. Only the king, and perhaps a few priests, were permitted to enter. What happened there was not public worship. It was something more intimate, more direct, a ritual exchange between the human representative and the divine presence. The king would ascend the long stairway. He would enter the chamber alone. He would perform the prescribed rituals, offerings, prayers, sacred formulas that had been passed down through generations. For what? For whom? The texts do not say exactly. They speak of the God dwelling there, of the God's presence being maintained, of the cosmic order being renewed through these encounters. But the God did not appear in the way. A person appears, there were no conversations. Ritual was repetition, not innovation. Maintenance, not transformation. It was as if the kings were keeping a door open, even though no one had walked through it in living memory. Why keep the door open? Perhaps because they had been taught that once, long ago, the gods did walk through. That once there had been direct contact, direct instruction, and that even though the gods had withdrawn, the connection must be maintained in case they ever chose to return. Or perhaps because the ritual itself was the knowledge, not knowledge in the sense of information, but knowledge in the sense of practice, of embodied tradition, of doing what was done before, because the doing itself carries meaning. Even when the original context is lost, the Sumerian calendar was complex. It tracked lunar months, solar years, the movements of Venus, the rising and setting of certain stars. It required constant adjustment to keep the ritual year aligned with the agricultural year. Priests spent enormous effort making sure the festivals fell at the correct times. Why such precision? In practical terms, it helped coordinate planting and harvest. But many agricultural societies manage with much simpler calendars. The Sumerian system was far more elaborate than strictly necessary for farming. It was as if they were tracking something else, something beyond the seasons, as if the movements of the heavens held meaning that had to be carefully observed. The planet Venus held particular significance. Venus, which appears as both morning star and evening star. Venus, which traces a distinctive pattern through the sky over an 8-year cycle. Venus, which was associated with Inanna, the most complex and powerful goddess in the Sumerian pantheon, recording not just when it appears and disappears, but the exact number of days it remains visible, the position relative to other stars, the correlation with earthly events. Why this obsession with Venus? Perhaps because it was remembered as significant, because in the knowledge passed down from before the flood, Venus held a special role, not just as a celestial object, but as a marker, a sign, a connection to something that needed to be carefully monitored. The kings maintained this observation. Generation after generation, the priests tracked Venus, recorded its movements, preserved the data in their arfur over their enemies, not because it predicted the future with any reliability, but because they had been taught to watch. And so they watched. This is what it meant to be a guardian of knowledge, not to create new things, but to keep old things alive. To perform the rituals, even when their meaning had faded. To track the stars, even when the reason for tracking them was no longer entirely clear. To build the temples in the old proportions, to speak the old formulas, to observe the old festivals, to trust that the ancestors who established these patterns knew something worth preserving, even if the full understanding had been lost. There is a humility in this that is easy to miss. The Sumerian kings did not claim to possess ultimate wisdom. They did not present themselves as sources of new revelation. They were intermediaries, channel vessels through which something older and larger flowed. In the hymns written to honor them, they are praised not for their own brilliance, but for their faithfulness to the divine order, for maintaining the me, for ensuring the temples were properly kept, for performing the rituals correctly. Their greatness lay in their service, in their willingness to carry a burden that had been placed on them by forces they could not fully comprehend. The goddess Inanna, in one of the most famous Sumerian poems, descends to the underworld. She passes through 7 gates, and at each gate she must remove a piece of her divine power, her crown, her jewels, until she stands naked and powerless before Ereshkigal, the queen of the dead. She dies there, and the world above begins to wither, until finally, through the intervention of Enki, she is restored and allowed to return. But she cannot leave the underworld without providing a substitute. Someone must take her place, and so she chooses her husband, Dumuzi, condemning him to spend half the year in the realm of death. The story is often interpreted as a seasonal myth, Inanna and Dumuzi, representing the cycle of growth and decay, fertility and barrenness. But perhaps it is also a story about knowledge and loss. Inanna descends to the underworld seeking power, seeking wisdom from the realm of the dead, and she gains it, but at enormous cost. She must surrender everything she possesses. She must die and be reborn. And even then she cannot keep what she has learned without sacrifice. The knowledge of the underworld, the knowledge of death, of endings, of what lies beneath, cannot be held lightly. It exacts a price. The Sumerian kings may have understood themselves as living this myth, as people who carried knowledge from a dead world, who held the wisdom of ancestors who no longer lived, who maintained connection with powers that had withdrawn into silence. They were Inanna, returning from the underworld. They brought something precious back with them, but they carried it at the cost of perpetual service, perpetual watchfulness, perpetual awareness that what they held could be lost again. And so they guarded it, in their temples, in their careful preservation of lists and formulas and sacred proportions. They guarded it not for themselves, but for those who would come after, for the generations who might someday need what the old world had known. There is a kind of knowledge that lives in gestures rather than words, in the way a hand moves when performing a ritual, in the precise angle of a brick laid in a wall, in the rhythm of a chant that has been repeated so many times its meaning has dissolved into pure sound. The Sumerian kings preserved knowledge this way, not always in writing. Writing came later, and even then it captured only part of what mattered, but in practice, in the doing, in the careful repetition of actions that had been done before, and before that, and before that, stretching back through time until the original doing was lost in the mist of ages. Consider the sacred marriage ritual. Once a year, during the New Year festival, the king of a Sumerian city would enact a ritual union with the high priestess of Inanna. This was not a symbolic gesture performed at a distance. It was an actual physical union, carried out in the sacred chamber of the temple, witnessed by no one, spoken of only in carefully prescribed language. The purpose, as recorded in the texts, was to ensure fertility, the fertility of the land, the fertility of the people. Through this ritual union, the divine and human worlds were joined, and the life force was renewed for another year. But why this specific ritual? Why this particular form? Why the requirement that it be the king himself, not a priest, not a representative, but the actual ruler of the city? Perhaps because it was remembered that this was how it had been done in the beginning. Not remembered clearly, not with certainty about who had done it first or why, but remembered nonetheless, carry forward in the collective knowledge of the priesthood, in the traditions that each king inherited when he took the throne. The ritual was older than any king could trace, older than the cities themselves, perhaps, a practice from the world before, preserved because it was believed, or half believed, or simply accepted, that this was what maintained the connection between heaven and earth. And so the king performed it, not because he understood every nuance of its meaning, not because he had received a revelation commanding it, but because his father had done it, and his father's father, and all the kings before them. Back to the time when kingship first descended from heaven, the ritual was the knowledge, the preservation was the wisdom. There were other rituals, equally ancient, equally specific. The feeding of the gods, actual meals prepared daily and placed before the divine images, the incantations spoken over the sick, the offerings made to the dead, the careful burial practices that ensured the deceased would find their way to the underworld properly. Each of these practices followed precise forms, exact words, particular times of day or phases of the moon. Why such precision? Because precision was what had been passed down, because the ancestors who survived the flood had carried these practices with them, and had taught that they mattered, that they were not arbitrary, that they came from a time when the gods still instructed humanity directly in how the world should be maintained. The kings did not question this, or if they did, they questioned privately. And they performed the rituals anyway because their role was not to innovate. Their role was to preserve. In the city of Lagash, there was a king named Gudea. Gudea ruled sometime around 4,000 years ago. He was not a great conqueror. His kingdom was small. He left no record of military victories, no tales of empire building. What Gudea did was build temples, many temples, and he recorded in extraordinary detail exactly how those temples were to be built. He described receiving a dream in which the god Ningirsu appeared to him and commanded him to build a temple. The dream was complex. Filled with symbols Gudea could not fully interpret on his own, so he consulted a dream interpreter, a priestess who could read the divine message. She told him the specifications, the measurements, the materials, the orientation, and so Gudea gathered materials from across the known world, cedar from distant mountains, gold and silver, precious stones. He recruited craftsmen, he organized labor, he oversaw every detail of the construction, and when the temple was complete, he inscribed the entire process on clay cylinders, some of the longest continuous texts from ancient Sumer, not hymns of praise to himself, but careful documentation of how the temple was built, so that it could be built again if it were ever destroyed. This was what mattered to Gudea, not his own glory, but the preservation of the pattern, the maintenance of the connection between earth and heaven through properly constructed sacred space. He understood himself as a servant of something larger, as a keeper of knowledge that had been entrusted to him and that he must pass forward intact. The statues of Gudea that survive show a man with hands folded in prayer, eyes open, expression calm, not the posture of a conqueror, but of a supplicant, of someone waiting, listening, attending to something beyond himself. This was the ideal of Sumerian kingship, not dominance but service, not expansion but preservation, not innovation but faithful transmission. The world had already been destroyed. Once the knowledge that survived was fragile, precious beyond measure. The king's task was not to add to it, but to keep it alive. There were kings who failed in this task. The king list records dynasties that fell, cities that lost their prominence, rulers who were defeated in battle or overthrown by rivals. And when this happened, when a dynasty ended, there was always the question, what knowledge died with it? What rituals were forgotten? What texts were lost? What sacred proportions or astronomical observations or ritual forms vanished, when the priests who knew them were killed or scattered? This was the great fear, but the death of knowledge, the breaking of the chain, the loss of what had been preserved at such cost for so many generations. And so the kings who came after, who established new dynasties, went to great lengths to recover what had been lost. They sought out surviving priests. They retrieved tablets from ruined temples. They reconstruct rituals from fragmentary memories. They copied ancient texts, even when the language had changed so much that the scribes could barely understand what they were copying, because the continuity mattered more than comperfection, because it was better to preserve something imperfectly. The great library at Nippur contained thousands of tablets, grain receipts, and tax lists and legal contracts, but also literature, hymns, incantations, myth cycles, king lists, god lists, lexical texts that defined old words in newer language, bilingual dictionaries that were no longer spoken. Why preserve all of this? Because Nippur was remembered as a sacred city, the city of Enlil, king of the gods, the religious center of Sumer. Even when it was not the political capital, the library at Nippur was not just a repository of information. It was a safeguard against forgetting, a deliberate effort to hold ancestors from slipping away entirely. And the kings supported this. They funded the scribes. They commissioned copies of ancient texts. They ensured the library was maintained and expanded, not because they personally needed all this knowledge, but because they understood their role as guardians of a heritage that stretched back beyond the reach of memory. There is a text from Nippur, a lamentation for a destroyed city. The city had been sacked, its temples burned, its people killed or driven away, and in the aftermath a scribe composed a poem, a long keening meditation on loss. But the loss he mourned was not just the physical destruction. It was the silencing of the rituals, the ending of the daily offerings, the scattering of the priests who knew the old hymns. The house has been abandoned by its rightful lady. The text says, "The gods have departed from their dwellings." This was the true catastrophe. Not that buildings fell, but that the connection was broken, that the knowledge could no longer be transmitted, because there was no one left to receive it. The scribe who wrote this lamentation understood what was at stake. He was recording not just a historical event, but a spiritual disaster. The severing of a link to the past. The death of memory. And yet he wrote it down. He preserved the lamentation itself, so that even the memory of loss would not be lost. So that future generations would know what had been taken, what had vanished, what must be mourned. This too was the work of preservation. Not celebrating only what survived, but acknowledging what was lost. Holding space for grief, for the recognition that the chain of knowledge, no matter how carefully guarded, was always vulnerable. That it could break at any moment, that vigilance was required. Always that the work of transmission was never finished. That each generation had to choose again to carry forward what they had received. Generation after generation, they chose to serve rather than to innovate, to maintain the rituals, the temples, the sacred calendar, the astronomical observations, the ritual formulas. They chose to be custodians of a memory that was not fully their own, a memory of a world that had vanished, a memory that they guarded, quietly, faithfully, in the hope that it would matter, that someday someone would need what the old world had known. There are silences that carry more weight than any spoken word. The silence of a temple at dawn before the first ritual. The silence of a clay tablet drying in the sun, holding words that will outlast the hand that wrote them. The silence of a king standing alone at the summit of a ziggurat, performing gestures no one else will see. The Sumerian kings lived in that weighted silence. They spoke when the rituals required it. They issued decrees when governance demanded it. But beneath all the speaking was a deeper quiet, the awareness that they were holding something they could not fully articulate, something that lived in practice rather than explanation, in continuation rather than understanding. The question that haunts this story is simple and unanswerable. What exactly were they preserving? If you asked a Sumerian king, he might have said, the order of the world, the May, the divine principles that allowed civilization to function, the rituals that kept the gods present, or at least kept the door open for their presence. But beneath these answers perhaps was something more fundamental, a memory of coherence. The world before the flood was remembered not just as a place, but as a state of being, a time when knowledge was whole rather than fragmented, when the gods walked among humanity and instruction was direct, when the patterns of existence were clear and the purpose of each practice was understood. The flood had shattered that coherence, not just physically, not just in the drowning of cities and the scattering of people, but epistemically in the realm of knowing. What survived were pieces, fragments, echoes of a system that had once been complete. The kings preserved these fragments not because they could reconstruct the whole, but because the fragments were all that remained. And perhaps because they trusted, or had been taught to trust, that the fragments still held power, that even incomplete, even only partially understood, the knowledge from before the flood still mattered, still maintained some connection to the order that had been lost. Consider the practice of heposcopy, or divination, through the examination of sheep livers. This was not superstition to the Sumerians, it was a science, a precise technical discipline requiring years of training. The diviners learned to read the surface of the liver like a map, interpreting every lobe, every discoloration, every irregularity, as a sign of divine will or cosmic condition. They have models made of clay, showing the liver divided into regions, each region labeled with its meaning. They had text cataloging thousands of observations. If the liver shows this configuration, it portends that outcome. Why the liver specifically? Modern scholars have various theories, but the Sumerians believed the liver was the seat of life force, the organ through which divine and earthly realms intersected. And they practiced heposcopy with utter seriousness, because it had been practiced before them and before them. Back to a time when Da believed, this method had been given by the gods as a way to understand the hidden patterns of reality. Was it effective? Did it predict the future? Perhaps not in any literal sense, but that may not have been the point. The point may have been the practice itself. The discipline, the careful attention, the willingness to look deeply at the world for signs of pattern and meaning. The cultivation of a mindset that treated reality as intentional, as legible, as responsive before major decisions. Not blindly, not automatically, but as part of a larger process of discernment that included practical calculation, political wisdom, and this other element, this consultation with patterns inherited from the ancestors. They were drawing on a reservoir of knowledge they had not created, trusting in a methodology, maintaining a practice because it connected them to something older than themselves. This was true of so much of what they did, the sacred numbers used in temple construction, multiples of 67s and 12s, proportions that seemed to recur across different contexts. These were not arbitrary, they had been passed down as significant, as carrying meaning that might not be fully explicable but that should be honored nonetheless. The names of the months, tied to agricultural cycles and celestial events, the festivals that marked the turning of the year, the prayers spoken at sunrise, the offerings made at sunset, all of it was guarded, because the kings understood, or had been taught, that they lived in a depleted world, a world after catastrophe, a world where the fullness of knowledge had been lost, and only remnants remained. Their task was not to restore what was lost, that was impossible. Their task was to prevent any further loss, to hold the line, to pass forward what they had received, even if it arrived in their hands already incomplete. There is a particular poignancy in this, the recognition that you are not the beginning of something, but the middle, that you did not receive the knowledge whole, and you will not pass it on whole, that you are simply one link in a chain that extends both backward and forward into darkness, and your responsibility is only to not be the link that breaks. The Sumerian kings were not heroes in the way we often think of heroes. They did not slay dragons or found new empires or discover new truths. They did something quieter and perhaps more difficult. They submitted to a discipline of preservation. They accepted their role as custodians rather than creators. They chose service over glory, and in doing so they kept something alive long enough for it to be written down, long enough for the clay tablets to be fired and buried and, thousands of years later, excavated, long enough for us now to catch glimpses of what they guarded, not the fullness of it. We are even further from the source than they were. We read their texts as archaeological artifacts, puzzling over meanings, reconstructing context, guessing at what has been lost. But we read them, and in reading them we encounter the memory they preserved, the echoes of the world before the flood, the fragments of knowledge, generation after generation, to carry them forward. The texts from Sumer often end with colophons, short notes added by the scribe who copied them. These colophons are formulaic. They give the scribe's name, sometimes the date, sometimes the name of the king under whose reign the copying was done, and then often a phrase, written down and collated so that it shall not be forgotten. So that it shall not be forgotten. This was the purpose, the driving imperative, the sacred obligation, to remember, to preserve, to ensure that what the ancestors knew did not vanish completely from the earth. The kings enabled this work. They funded the scribes. They built the libraries. They maintained the institutions that held memory in place, not for their own aggrandizement. The colophons rarely mention the kings except in passing. The focus is on the text itself, on its preservation. On its transmission, the king's role was to create the conditions under which memory could survive, to provide stability, to ensure that the work of preservation was not interrupted by war or famine or political collapse. When they succeeded at this, knowledge survived. When they failed, when dynasties fell and cities burned, knowledge died, and the scribes who came after mourned what was lost and worked desperately to recover what they could from the ruins. Preservation and loss, continuity and rupture. The slow accumulation of written knowledge punctuated by catastrophes that destroyed whole archives, whole traditions, whole lineages of experts. But the impulse to preserve remained, even after Sumer fell, even as Akkadians and Babylonians and Assyrians rose to power. Even then the new scribes continued to copy the old Sumerian texts. They learned a dead language so they could read what the ancestors had written. They preserved texts whose meaning they could only partially grasp. They maintained the memory of a world even more distant from them than it had been from the Sumerian kings, because the chain mattered, because continuity mattered, because the knowledge from the world before the flood, however fragmentary, however obscure, still held value that should not be surrendered lightly. The last known cuneiform tablet was written in the 1st century of the Common Era, nearly 3,000 years after the Sumerian language died. But the script continued, the practice of pressing wedges into clay to hold memory in place, the discipline of preservation that the Sumerian kings had fostered, and that their successors carried forward across millennia. And then it stopped. The tradition finally broke. The scribes died. The tablets were buried. And for nearly 2,000 years, no one could read cuneiform. The knowledge was lost, not destroyed. Few tablets survived, baked hard by time and fire, lying beneath the sands of Iraq, but illegible, silent. The memory they held, locked away, inaccessible. Until, in the 19th century, scholars learned to read cuneiform again, and the voices of ancient Sumer spoke. Once more, the king lists, the hymns, the myths, the rituals, the careful observations of the stars, the lamentations for destroyed cities, the instructions passed from father to son, all of it preserved, all of it waiting, because the Sumerian kings had chosen, because they had understood themselves not as masters of knowledge, but as its servants, because they had accepted the burden of preservation and carried it faithfully. And now we inherit what they guarded, not completely, not perfectly. The chain did break, much was lost, but something survived. Something whispers, and the quiet determination of those who watched it vanish and refused to let it be forgotten entirely. Tonight, the stars are the same. Stars the Sumerian kings watched, the same patterns wheeling overhead, the same Venus rising before dawn, the same moon tracking its phases through darkness and light. But the men who watched them with such care are gone. The cities they built have crumbled into tells, mounds of earth, concealing layer upon layer of forgotten life. The temples are silent. The rituals are no longer performed. The gods, if they were ever present, have long since withdrawn into whatever realm receives a Banburi dais. What remains are the tablet, clay pressed with wedges, baked by fire or simply by time, buried in the ruins of libraries, in temple foundations, in the collapsed rooms of scribble schools, and on those tablets the memory, not complete, not pristine, but present nonetheless. The kings who guarded that memory did not know we would read it. They could not have imagined archaeologists, sifting through the ruins of their cities, deciphering their language, reconstructing their world from fragments. They preserved it for their own descendants, for the generations they hoped would come after. But in preserving it for them, they preserved it for us as well, and so we inherit their burden now. Not the burden of kingship, not the burden of ritual, but the burden of memory itself. The question of what to do with knowledge that arrives incomplete, with traditions whose origins are obscure, with fragments of a warrior. Do we dismiss it because it is not whole, because we cannot verify its sources, because it comes to us wrapped in language about gods and floods and ages we cannot scientifically confirm, or do we recognize that it carries something nonetheless? Some echo of human experience, human wisdom, human response to a world that has always been larger and stranger than any single generation could fully comprehend. The Sumerian kings chose preservation over comprehension. They guarded what they could not fully explain. They trusted that the fragments mattered, even when the whole was beyond their reach. Perhaps that is the gift they offer us now across the silence of millennia. Not answers, not certainty, not a recovered golden age we can return to, but an example, a model of humble stewardship, a reminder that knowledge is fragile, that memory requires effort to maintain. They watched a world disappear, and they carried forward what they could, so that we might know even dimly that such a world existed, so that the forgetting would not be complete. And in the stillness of this moment, perhaps that is enough to know that once there were people who chose to remember, who bore the weight of memory faithfully, who passed the light forward through the darkness, one generation to the next, until it reached us here. Still burning, still fragile, still waiting to be carried onward into whatever silence comes next.